Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is José Barzola. I am the Conflict and Peace Specialist here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Welcome to our Advocacy for Social Justice Talk Story series, which is an opportunity to explore organized efforts and mechanisms for social change. Today's talk will be about Stockholm Syndrome and elite gymnastics, a study of the athlete-coach relationship with Kayttie Nakamura and myself moderating. Today's session, we'll discuss about Stockholm Syndrome within elite gymnastics, focusing on the complex dynamics between coaches and athletes. It explores the psychological and biological factors contributing to this phenomenon, as well as the implications and potential interventions to address it. Our main speaker today, Kayttie Nakamura, is a former elite trampoline gymnast for the United States. She's a two-time world champion and a former U.S. national team member and now serves as an athlete representative for USA Gymnastics. Currently, she's pursuing a doctorate in clinical psychology, a PsyD at Chaminade University, and just finished her first year, combining her athletic experience with a passion for mental health. And she did make me aware that today is the first day of the Olympics. So everything just kind of serendipitously came together. Um, and today's event is sponsored by my office as the Conflict and Peace Specialist. And to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to our good friend, Kayttie. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm excited. I actually did this presentation a few months ago at the IBAT conference, so it's basically a revamped one and abridged version, but I'm excited to share my knowledge and experience with you all. So you can go ahead and get started. Let's see. All right, perfect. Okay. So as you know, my specialty or sport was trampoline gymnastics. So naturally, I wanted to kind of delve into this topic a little more about Stockholm syndrome between athletes and coaches, because I think that it's a topic that not a lot of people know about, but it is very prevalent within the gymnastics world. So let's get into it. All right. So, Jose already said a little bit about me, but I'll just like elaborate a little more. I was a gymnast for 11 years for the United States in trampoline gymnastics. I was on the United States national team ever since 2015. I retired in 2021, and now I am an athlete representative, and I just advocate for athletes and voice concerns to the higher committees of USA Gymnastics. So, okay. So just like a basic definition of what Stockholm syndrome is, it's a phenomenon in which people develop feelings towards their captors over abusers or abusers over time, positive feelings. And it's interesting because I didn't know that Stockholm syndrome existed within any sort of serious relationship until a few years ago, which is what piqued my interest in this subject. So the PowerPoint just goes over how Stockholm syndrome occurs between athletes and coaches and like the underlying mechanisms behind it. All right, so let's get into the psychological factors. So there's stress tolerance, and then we can go to the next slide. Okay, yes. So gymnasts don't have any off season. It's very unique gymnastics as we're required to maintain peak physical and mental condition throughout the year. There's this unrelenting demand for the highest level of performance, which pretty much just heightens your stress levels at all times of the day. And because it's a year-round sport, the only like break, and I say that with quotes because it's not really a break, is in January, which is still technically a training month. So once again, not really a break. And once you get an injury or anything like that, it sucks because you basically have to deal with it for the rest of your life. For me, I had chronic shin splints. I had like a lot of back pain. Like there were some mornings where like I couldn't even walk, but it was kind of some of like one of those things that you kind of just had to deal with because yeah, there's no off season. And then on top of that, there's that emotional exhaustion due to the physical and mental toll. So there's injuries, and then a lot of times gymnasts end up finding themselves wrestling with the physical and emotional toll of the sport. And then to add even more, there's pressure, right? There's pressure from coaches, parents, media, and ourselves. We not only put an unrealistic amount of pressure on ourselves, but there's also a lot of unrealistic expectations that can come from all sides. And it can become, once again, like another factor that goes into emotional exhaustion. In the picture, you see Simone Biles. If you don't know Simone Biles, she is an Olympic all-around champion, 23-time world medalist, 7-time Olympic medalist. And during the Tokyo Olympics, she had mental blocks. And during that time, the media had basically portrayed her as someone who just gave up. But she had lost move syndrome, and it's a real thing. I've had it before, and I think a lot of people who have not done gymnastics before, it's really easy for them to comment on how a gymnast performs and stuff like that. But it is a real thing, and kind of it's kind of hard to, I guess, comment when you haven't really been in that position, and also just to make a decision when your first priority is your mental health, whether, yeah, when your first priority is your mental health and you're not just trying to do it to like be like the American hero and push that narrative. So, okay. Yes. So, oh, can we go next slide? Yes. Okay. So, when I was researching, there were three techniques I found in this awesome article that coaches use to basically reinforce obedience with athletes. And the first one is isolation, second, regulation, intimidation. So I'll briefly go through each one. So we'll go through the first one, isolation. So many training sessions occur during the later hours of the day when no one is in gym. Therefore, there's already not a lot of people there watching practices. And while I didn't necessarily have like closed practices, um, parents don't usually come and watch training because it's like 3 to 4 hour practices. And let's be honest, no one wants to stay there for 3 to 4 hours. Um, but on top of that, parents are basically entrusting these coaches, even sometimes allowing like athletes to live with them. And coaches can take advantage of these vulnerabilities, especially if an athlete moves away from home for gymnastics, which is a very common thing. Coaches know that gymnasts may not have very many friends just because of how often they're in the gym rather than like doing school, going out with friends, and they take advantage of that. Um, I know for me, like I wasn't able to do a lot of the normal things that I wanted to do as a kid, like go out with friends, like go to school dances, go to parties and stuff like that. But yeah, this all just ties into isolation. Then we have regulation. So on the right, you see a picture of Lori Hernandez. She's the 2016 Olympic gold and silver medalist, and she was also a U.S. national team member. On her left is her head coach, Maggie Haney. And it's interesting because for regulation, basically things like regulating body weight, regulating what we eat and stuff like that. Her coach, who is no longer allowed to coach as a coach of USA Gymnastics, she would call Lori things like busty during every practice. I even had an instance myself where I had a coach and whose daughter was training for the Olympics, and he had told her that she looked appealing until she gained 16 pounds. And these were normal things that I heard during practices like almost every day. We're also just forced to compete even with chronic injuries because if we don't compete, there's consequences both by coaches and with the selection processes because there's a certain amount of competitions that we have to compete at every year in order to qualify for bigger international competitions such as the Olympic Games or the World Championships. Finally, with regulation, there's instances where coaches can also just manipulate what an athlete says to the media in order to fit their narrative, in order to be seen in a more positive light. Then there's intimidation. I would say that this is the biggest factor of all three techniques. And this is basically just threats from coaches for not performing well or acting a certain way. My coach always expected the three things: discipline, respect, and appreciation. Um, but it was difficult for me to juggle with because I didn't feel like those same three qualities were presented by him when he was coaching us. There was a time where I remembered before every competition, the coach would tell us that if he ever saw us crying, that he would take us behind the bleachers and yell at us. I've also been told that I've had a corrupted nervous system. I've been told that I would never win. I've been told that, I should just find another sport because there's just no point in me doing gymnastics anymore. Once again, these are all just super common things that you kind of just become used to when you're a gymnast because you kind of think that's just what it takes, even though that's not necessarily true. Okay, next slide. Yes, so I thought it was funny that the Olympics, the opening ceremony was today because of this coaching duo right here. So this is Bella and Marta Caroli. They are the winningest coaching duo in artistic gymnastics history. And I wanted to talk about the ranch a little bit. So I trained here a few times. I've been there for training camps, selection camps, but it was basically like the epicenter of every single selection and training camp within USA Gymnastics. So whether you were an artistic gymnast, trampoline gymnast, rhythmic gymnast, you came to this camp to train. Um, you had to be like exclusively invited to participate in these camps. And just a little bit about my experience. I remember the first time I went there, I was 11 years old. And I was super excited because, you hear about the Crowleys and you know like all the things that they've accomplished. And being invited to this camp, like personally, is like such an honor. So going into it, I was super excited. But I remember once we arrived at that camp, like the energy had just dropped. It all of a sudden became super scary because like we were in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't able to contact my parents because there was no cell service. The food was basically inedible. There was an inside joke between all the gymnasts at the camp that you should just bring food like from home because you're probably not going to eat the food at the camp. Um, there's also so many injuries that happen because we're expected to train like 24/7 at that camp until we go home. And there are even teammates that I had who had to stay with people that were years older than them, which might not have necessarily been appropriate. But it just goes to show like how regulated that abuse was, like for how many years until finally that gym closed in 2016. Okay. All right. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the coaches, obviously, there's coaches that want you to win at all costs, even after detriment of your physical and mental health. Once again, performing despite injury or despite mental blocks, because there are consequences that are associated when you don't compete. Um, Coaches can perpetuate this culture of silence, right? Because athletes pretty much normalize that the behaviors that their coaches do to them are just normal because it's just happened for so long. We learn to like just deal with it, and we end up not really reporting it due to fear of retaliation or just knowing that our coaches have had this like long-standing reputation within the sport. Yep. And then teammates. So I don't mean to say teammates as in like blaming them like for whatever's going on. I'm saying this because a lot of teammates that you have may not even be aware that they're contributing to the abusive behaviors. Your teammates are in close proximity with you 24 hours a day. So like naturally you're gonna be drawn closer to them and you're gonna form like a bond with them. But where it can become detrimental is where they view certain abusive behaviors as something that is normal or even as a rite of passage. I remember when I had decided to confront my coach about the abusive behaviors, and I had teammates who had heavily downplayed the severity. Even when, I had decided to talk to my coach about it, but it wasn't necessarily that they were taking the coach's side, but I think it was just because that they had normalized that it was just the way that it was. Okay. And then last thing is parents. So parents are unaware, but it's because like they're not usually knowledgeable like about the sport itself, right? Which is not really their fault. And that's why they trust coaches so much because the coaches know more than the athlete, they know more than the parent, so they entrust coaches to take care of their kid. But that can play a factor into abuse, right? So parents may believe that the abusive behaviors that they see at practice or at competition are just the what it takes to succeed. And when I was thinking about it, I think it could be a generational thing because I think, before like the the abusive behaviors were kind of just something that was normal in sports, and now that we're moving towards a more positive culture where we're trying not to do those behaviors anymore and we're trying to move towards more positive coaching, I think it's hard for some parents to, I guess, draw that fine line between being strict and then between being borderline abusive, and I think that line can get blurred. um I remember my head coach and, his daughter, they both ended up being my coaches, but once the daughter started coaching me, she had basically picked up all the coaching habits that my head coach had. So she wasn't even aware of it as she was coaching, but parents really do play a big factor in how their kids end up, I guess, handling things that happen within the sport. Okay, next slide. Okay, so On your right is Caitlin Ohashi. She's a former U.S. national team member, and then she was an NCAA athlete for USA or for UCLA. Um, and she actually had a very bad experience with USA Gymnastics. She had coaches that just told her that she looked like she had swallowed an elephant or pig. Once again, just very normal things for her that she had heard every day during practice. And I really love her story because her entire experience was turned around due to her experience at NCAA gymnastics with UCLA and with Coach Val Condos. But once again, it goes back to the body aesthetics and weight, right? Like our sport places a huge emphasis on what you look like in the air. And that's why sometimes coaches will try to regulate what you eat, even though it's not appropriate. Um, Execution is one of the primary scores that you're judged on. So body aesthetic, once again, how graceful you look in the air, and therefore huge emphasis on weight. Okay. Then there's risk of injury. So in the spirit of the Olympics, I think a lot of people will probably recognize this gymnast right here. It's Carrie Strug, 1996 Olympic gold medalist in the team final. She landed this fall on one leg, and the media basically portrayed this as her being an American hero. But what a lot of people don't know is that Carrie actually didn't have to compete in order for them to win the medal because the USA had already won the medal by 2/10, I believe, before she had competed. Um, but it's interesting to see how the media kind of twisted that narrative into calling her American hero because she landed on one leg and she basically won the medal for her country. But when we look at how things have changed till now, like that should never have been allowed to happen. And I think that there's things like that. And she had like a career-ending injury that was basically just a sacrifice for the United States. Um, More broadly, like we have the highest risk of injury just because of how precise we have to be all the time. There's so much anxiety surrounding getting injuries, like especially during trainings where we're trying to get new skills. Um, so we're not only anxious about injuries, but then once we get injuries, then we still have to compete. I remember like having to still compete despite serious injuries. Like I had to compete at the 2018 and 2019 World Championships despite like serious shin splits and back pain. And I was still expected like to bring home the gold medal. Okay. Perfection. All gymnasts are pretty much perfectionists because of the cruel nature of the sport. Like I said, there's so many things that go into it. Execution, difficulty, how high you're jumping in the air. And with that said, we're constantly being evaluated by literally everyone. There's coaches, there's judges, there's spectators, there's parents, and then there's ourselves, right? And tying that back to Simone with the media and Lori with Maggie Haney or even Caitlin Ohashi with USA Gymnastics, um, everyone is always going to have something to say. And I think that contributes to gymnasts being so critical of themselves. There's so many long hours of training and so many competitions that it just leads to exhaustion because we're just trying to be perfect all the time, even though it's like not realistic. Okay. And I think this is one of the most important things that a lot of people don't talk about, but it's retirement after doing a sport. Just being a gymnast at a young age, you're not really able, once again, to do the things that you would want to do as a kid, like go out with your friends, go to school dances, do all these things. You're only doing gymnastics. And because of that, like your identity, you feel like it's set for life. And I know that I took years to retire because I thought like I was basically nothing without gymnastics. Like when people talked to me, like it felt like they only knew me as a gymnast. They didn't know me as the 4.0 student. They didn't know me as the like a good daughter. They didn't know me as this and that, right? So I really thought that my only identity was being a gymnast. So that makes it harder for people to retire, and then that makes them stay in that abusive relationship between the coach and athlete even longer. You also just don't even realize that the abuse happened until after you retired a lot of the times. And even then, like you're unaware of how to process it. Um, some people, unfortunately, just never even realize that they've been abused. Um, we're also just going through physical changes, right? You're not extremely fit anymore and your body is adjusting. So all these things are just a lot of factors that kind of contribute to gymnasts wanting to stay in that abusive environment for even longer. Okay. And then there are a few challenges with this topic, right? So the first one, like I said, normalization. We're unaware of the abuse, cycle continues, period. Athletes are vulnerable to abuse by coaches due to the three techniques that I talked about: isolation, regulation, intimidation. And, we become so dependent on coaches because we believe that they're trying to do what is best for us, even though that might not necessarily be the case. And then finally, there's just like a lot of limited research that's available, It's a very niche topic, elite gymnastics, and therefore, once again, not a lot of research. So it's challenging to, find relevant information on it. Okay. Okay, physiological responses. So I'm going to quickly go through these slides. Yeah, so there's two physiological responses I want to talk about, and it's cortisol and chronic stress, right? So elite gymnasts, we have high amounts of cortisol all the time. We are never not stressed because we are always competing and training. I'll talk more about like the long-term effects of that later, but then that ties into chronic stress, right? Our cortisol levels are high all the time, and therefore our chronic stress is also going to be high. We become more susceptible to things like injuries, getting sick because our stress levels are over the top. Your bodily functions as your stress increases shuts down. So things like your immune system when you have high levels of cortisol. And something interesting I found like with my research was that, when gymnasts do get sick, high intensity exercise obviously suppresses the immune system, which suggests that athletes should use low and moderate intensity training instead. However, this is not a feasible thing. We can't just go to low intensity training in a sport like gymnastics. So once again, makes gymnasts more likely to be sick, makes them more likely to be injured. Okay. Oxytocin and dopamine. So we know that oxytocin plays a huge role in forming the bond between athletes and coaches. And then dopamine is what basically reinforces the bond because, dopamine has those feel-good chemicals associated with pleasure and reward. So I wanted to talk about small acts of kindness, right? So a lot of times coaches, 99% of the time, they will be abusive, but then there's that 1% of the time where they give you compliments. And that kind of retains that bond. Oxytocin is that compliment, which helps strengthen the bond. And then dopamine is the compliment gives the athlete a sense of reward, which is why the athlete continues to be coached by the same coach because, even though they are abusive 99% of the time, that 1% of the time where they give athletes compliments is what kind of keeps the athletes in. Okay. My favorite part, interventions, because there are ways we can prevent this. So, on that table, while we want a lot of gymnasts to be on the left side of the table, which is the resilience factor side, that is not the case like many of the times, right? So let's start with support systems. Having a strong system outside of the sport is a resilience factor, but a lot of times athletes are vulnerable because the only support system that they have usually comes within the sport. Coaches, parents, teammates, right? Which is not good. Having a support system outside the sport is important because, you want athletes to be able to socialize with other people who are going to provide empathy and encouragement when they are going through those tough times. And, once you retire, that social network is pivotal in adjusting to normal life. There's also like that sense of self, right? So while we want athletes to have a healthy sense of self-esteem and so that they're more likely to assert themselves and confront the abusive behaviors, it's not usually the case because we have that strong desire of approval due to those biological factors that I talked about, like dopamine and oxytocin, as well as just the want to be liked by coaches in general in order to make them happy. Okay. So I'm a little biased because this is something that I wanted to go into in the future, but sports psychologists are probably one of the most helpful interventions. The guy on the right is Simone Biles sports psychologist Robert Andrews. He was also the sports psychologist for Laurie Hernandez and some other athletes that competed in the 2016 Olympics. But interestingly, USA Gymnastics did not provide sports psychologists until last year, which is pretty crazy. They also did not start offering free mental health care for athletes until like this year or last year for athletes on the national team. So even more so, we need sports psychologists. Gymnastics is the most challenging sport mentally due to all the factors I previously discussed. And I will die on that hill because like I said, We're performing extremely difficult skills in the air. We're dealing with the physical, the mental, emotional toll. And then if we're dealing with an abusive coach, there's that too, and so many other things, right? So sports psychologists are super important. And I think that having an outside provider rather than an in-house provider would be super helpful for gymnasts in order to process what they're going through with a psychologist who is skilled and is able to take things from an unbiased perspective. And not only applies to gymnastics, but it applies to all sports in which there is like really high level athletes, right? So elite athletes, any elite athlete could benefit from having a sports psychologist, which is why it's definitely one of my main interventions. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening. I think we're going to do questions.
Thank you so much for that. And I apologize if you felt rushed in any capacity, but that was a really good insight not only into the field of athletics as well as your own personal journey. I myself don't consider myself an athlete, so it is a lot of what I do through my own work is, trying to get folks to be aware about lived experiences and how these lived experiences shape our perspective in life and hopefully build a little more compassion, empathy toward each other. So I'm hoping that today's session does exactly that for folks, especially with the Olympics, taking into consideration we may get lost so much in the patriotism or the nationalism of like, yes, rooting for your country, but rarely maybe we think about like what are the underlying layers of pressure and stress that folks competing have gone through, the trauma that's there. So yeah, no, so thank you so much. And I love the serendipitousness of so thank you. We do have a question from someone in the audience. What advice would you give to parents of those in sports?
It's a good question. I think there's two things I would say. The first one is one, being able to recognize the signs of abuse. And then two is being the biggest advocate for your child. Um, So I'll go into the first one a little bit. And the signs that I'm talking about, like sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're not, but you can kind of tell like when a child is going through abuse, obviously if there's physical signs. But I know like for me, there were times where I was like, I did not want to go to practice and I like refused to go to practice. So that's one of the things. If your child's telling you, hey, I really, really don't want to go to practice. They might not elaborate on it, but I know for me, like that's how it manifested for me. There's also just like sudden changes in behavior. So if your child was like naturally really happy and then you notice that they're suddenly depressed, super angry. For me, I was super angry. Um, then that's how you know that something might be up. So just signs like that. And even like just like withdrawal and isolation, because I think a lot of times that's a really normal thing in abuse within the sport. The second one, obviously, yeah, just be the biggest advocate for your child. I think like I've met a lot of people who wish that their parents had advocated for them more. Um, and just stood up for them. And I felt like a lot of times, like in my experience, there were times where I wished my parents stood up for me more, especially when I was going through whatever I was going through with my coaches. And they it's I think that you're their biggest cheerleader, but you also have to be their biggest support. Like you also have to be like their, I don't know, like their hero, you know what I mean? Because they look up to you. You're their number one like line of defense. And yeah.
Thank you. Some additional questions. What expertise do sports psychologists need?
Yeah, so you can get your PsyD. Um, but I think it's really helpful like if you already have experience obviously within sports. So like for me, like because like I did gymnastics for so long, I would want to specialize in doing gymnastics, but even being like a coach or even just being heavily involved in a sport, you don't necessarily have to be an athlete. But I think just being involved, like talking to athletes, doing things like being an athlete representative, you kind of are able to see a lot of the different problems within different sports. And I think that kind of knowledge can help you to be a sports psychologist.
Thank you. Um, so I just have a couple questions of my own while our community adds other questions. But what So knowing what you know now, how do you foresee going forward? Like, are you still actively involved in athletics? And I imagine somewhere down the road, if you decide to have your own children, you might get them involved. So what would you do differently, I guess? Any words of wisdom?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, I'm the athlete rep right now, so um just being involved, like sitting in on meetings basically and just trying to advocate for athletes, just like for better policies in general, because a lot of times athletes are not able to voice those concerns like to those higher committees. So I'm kind of like that in between athletes and USA Gymnastics, which is like all the way up here, right? Um, and then to answer your second question, what would I do differently? I think a lot of times, I think if I were a coach, I guess I can speak from that perspective. It's less so focusing on the things that the athlete did wrong and more so focusing on the things that they did right. Because you don't need to be like a coach that is just telling them that they're doing good all the time, but there's a difference between being a critical coach and then being an abusive coach, right? So you need to be able to draw that line. And the way that I do that sometimes when I coach is it's called the coaching sandwich. So I'll tell people, hey, good job. I noticed you really tried to stick the landing. And then the next thing is like the more critical thing. So you'd say, next time, let's try to keep your legs together. And then you end it off with another positive, but still, really good job. Let's just try it again. So it's stuff like that. Simple things that you can add to your routine when you're coaching that I think can really lift up athletes rather than pulling them down. Um, and I think I've noticed a lot of times, like throughout my experience, there were really positive coaches and their athletes were able to compete at the highest level and still win. So I think it's important to know that like abuse is not necessary in order for an athlete to be at the top. But
No, thank you. Thank you so much for spotlighting that specifically because it just reminds me of how, once more going back to the work that I do is, I always talk about like how do we develop some healthy, positive relationships? That's really what it's about. And part of it is creating a space that's welcoming, that you would, people go back to that golden rule, how treat others as you like to be treated. And many times it's like, how can we get some of that negative language out of our vocabulary? How can we approach things in a more optimistic, positive way? And how that can shift so much of the environment that we're nurturing and also create a space, a welcoming space where people would be able to come to you if something. So thank you for
exactly.
doing that in coaching and in parts of your life as well. Um, Question from the audience. Do you think do you think there needs to be more government oversight as far as regulations to protect kids from this type of abuse?
That's a good question. Hi, Auntie Donna. I noticed that you asked that question. I would say yes, but it's less so like with government and more so like within organization. I think the reason why USA Gymnastics got into a lot of trouble during the Nasser cases was because there weren't a lot of protocols that were already in place for abuse that protected the athletes. And I think that there needs to be more policies that protect the athletes rather than protect the organization, if that makes sense. So making sure that there's a standardized way to report. There's investigations and making sure athletes are, updated on every step of the investigation because I think that's something that they're currently lacking in. That would be really helpful. And then also just knowing the outcomes of the investigation and also providing them with the resources in order to cope with whatever they've reported or whatever's going on. But yeah, I do think that there are a lot of things that can be done differently at the organizational institutional level.
Thank you. Someone just made a comment. I'm seeing a lot of parallels between sports coaching and military command, both structure and discipline slash abuse.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think like obviously, I mean, I don't really know. I know like the military is intense. I don't know to what extent, just because I don't have not a lot of knowledge on it. But I would say like the way that we're coached basically feels like we're in a prison. And the reason I say that is because you're basically giving your life away like to the coach or whatever gym that you're competing for in order to win gold. So it's not just winning gold for yourself or winning gold for your country or whatever. You're kind of just trying to win gold for the satisfaction of your coaches. And I think in that case, like it can be like military-ish, prison-ish, like, environment.
Thank you. And one thing that just came to mind, I'm thinking like, this is something we're trying to approach from like even like a Hawaii or US mindset. Uh, I can just speculate, what is the process or what are the rights of athletes in other countries where it may not necessarily be conversations like these that are happening. So, and I don't know if like the Olympics, do they have any kind of regulations when or it's just like the coaches just do what you do. That's you just as long as they can perform. I'm not sure if you're
Yeah. It's more so like coaches, more so like individualized coaches, because whoever ends up going to the Olympics with the athlete is their personal coach. At least like for trampoline, I know that their personal coach will go with them, and it's not more like the national team coach that they select from like a pool of whatever. So it's basically whatever works for the coach and athlete, which can be a little bit problematic if you don't know what goes on behind the scenes. But
So the cycle of trauma can continue on, and there's rarely
yeah.
opportunities to like open up about it. Wow. I wonder, one of the things I always love to learn from folks that we have on here is just how do you, practice self-care and during, I mean, it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. I think when I retired, I did start seeking therapy regularly, and I think it really helped. Because in the beginning, I was super like apprehensive about it because I didn't really like believe in it. But I mean, obviously not now because I'm in a program for it. But I really think like for athletes, like having a therapist and just being able to talk to them, even if you don't feel like you have anything going on, like just being able to process the things that go on in your everyday life, I think is really beneficial. So that's one form of self-care for me. Another one is I love to sleep, so I'm always catching up on my sleep. If I'm not answering my phone, I'm probably in bed sleeping. And then the third one is just hanging out with friends and family because I really like my cup is filled when I spend time with the people that I love. So,
That's beautiful. Thank you. And yeah, and I'm glad that you've been able to have those coping strategies because it's so essential. And you brought up how in the training and I find it a little amusing that you talked about retirement already, and you have another career ahead of you still. But that's amazing. I just think about how it is tunnel vision. You don't have the opportunity to talk to others outside of the general routine of your everyday. So and I know as parents we get our kids involved in so many different activities, but as they get older, if they want to specifically get more refined, skilled in, eventually it just becomes one activity that kind of takes over. So yeah, I guess just check-ins with our youth is really what's essential. Making sure that they have someone that they can speak to openly about what's happening. So thank you for that. I'm just checking in to see if anybody else has any additional questions from our audience today. Guess we'll all be watching the Olympics with that extra layer now of perspective of like, especially the ones that are like, I always, the ones that get the medals, and the ones that don't, there's like so many years and decades of training, and uh, it's not your everyone gets a participation trophy like when you're growing up. Um,
I know we were talking about it earlier how you believe in participation trophies, but I'm gonna be so honest, I'm so anti participation trophy. I don't know if it's just because of like my competitiveness, but oh.
yeah, no, I get it. I get it. It is, I mean, it would kind of defeat the whole purpose of the Olympics if everyone got a participation trophy. Um, but yeah, no, I was just trying to figure out how can I'm always trying to think of recalibrate, rethink how we can I love it. I love getting that t-shirt, participation trophy t-shirt. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, just because we talk about, positive reinforcement and I guess if we were nurturing healthy relationships, and there was positive language being used, like, I don't think it would be so detrimental that, there are like that competition, but unfortunately, there's a lot of negativity that comes along with it of like, this is my job. This is what I've worked my whole career for, especially, I mean, I'm thinking from trying to understand the coach's perspective. And many times I look at it as probably like a lot of other careers. It's like, this is what I had to go through. And so this is what was modeled to me and how I was trained. And I was able to achieve this much. So I'm going to just carry it forward.
Right.
It's
Right.
easier to do what we know and what we're tunnel vision comfortable with than to, sometimes we talk about like leaning to your discomfort, let's try to recreate the wheel,
Right.
so I commend you for doing that, for becoming aware of that, and even pursuing, a career to be able to be that voice for folks, the voice that wasn't available to you, unfortunately. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. Um, well, if nobody else in the audience has any questions today, I just want to thank you so much for your time with us today and teaching us, uh, about this field. I was there at, the IVAC conference when I first heard of you, and it was just like an eye-opening experience. And I was like, oh, I want to provide the opportunity for others to also be, because I think there's further conversations to be had. And I think that's the beauty of these talk stories is that when folks watch these, let's have a conversation after that about
Yeah.
it, because it doesn't just have to end like, okay, let's go, binge something else. Let's sit around and have these further conversations about it. And how many shared opportunities are we missing out? And so I just want to make sure we're able to do that. So thank you, Kayttie, for your time with us today, and greatly appreciate you for being part of our community. And thank you,
Yeah.
everyone, for joining us today as well.
Thank you for joining, everyone. It was nice speaking to all of you.